car problems? Well, with Rhoda, getting them fixed is as easy as ordering takeout. They'll come pick up your car for free, do any repair or maintenance needed, and return it right to your driveway. They'll even give you a complimentary video inspection of your car so you can see what needs to be done. Perfect for those of us that maybe aren't so car savvy. Book your appointment online at roda.com. And lucky for you, CityCast listeners get a 20% discount on any service for up to $100 off. Just use the code CityCast20.
Today's interview was recorded last week before Saturday's assassination attempt on Donald Trump. But even then, the former president was leading in the polls, which for a lot of people in D.C. was a reason to focus on his plans for the city itself. He's made a lot of proposals, and some of them are remarkably radical. Today on CityCast DC, Cuneyt Dil from Axios is here to talk about his reporting about how Trump would change DC. Today is Monday, July 15th. I'm Michael Schaefer, and here's what DC is talking about. Hey, Cuneyt.
Hey, Michael.
So the Republican National Convention is here. Donald Trump is way up in a lot of polls. I don't know about you, but I've been hearing a lot of neighbors and conversations saying, what does this mean for our city? What has Trump promised to do to D.C. if he takes back the White House?
So we looked at what a second Trump presidency would mean for local D.C., and he's made a vow to, quote, take over our horribly run capital. It's actually one of his most commonly repeated phrases we found at Axios. And he's made it sort of a bit in his rally speeches. If you listen to many of them, if you happen to, I mean, you'll hear him rant about potholes and crime. He has a fixation on the street medians. He thinks they're not well built or something, but he turns it into this sort of campaign rally, a talking point, and he says it's going to be run properly when he gets in charge. And he even calls it an important part of his platform is to restore and rebuild DC into, quote, the crown jewel of our nation. So he's very fixated on Washington, D.C., the local town, in a way that presidents usually aren't. And this, for him, I think there are two reasons. A, he wants to make an example out of a Democratic-run city. And, of course, he wants to punish what he calls the swamp. And that gets to sort of what he wants to do on the federal level. And a lot of federal workers here are concerned about being fired, being purged, being removed, and their positions cut. You know, he wants to get rid of the Department of Education in its entirety. So on two levels, he would really impact D.C. in many ways.
So let's go to the local city first. He's made a big point of talking about the city as being crime-ridden, crime-infested, graffiti-strewn. Practically speaking, what has he promised to do to change that?
So this is sort of forecasting, but one thing he talks about is the National Guard. And he's talked about this in other cities and their context as well. But in D.C., he has a lot more control over the National Guard. He can send it in unilaterally. Other, states, the governor controls their National Guard, unlike the mayor of Washington. So that's something he could do, and he's talked about it. He's brought that to light. Now, crime has also decreased in D.C. I mean, you saw carjackings.
Let's not let facts get in the way of a good of a good plan to beat up on D.C.
He could send in the National Guard, but, crime is down, so maybe that's not something he wants to do anymore, perhaps. But he can also appoint a tough-on-crime federal prosecutor for D.C., someone who would really, take a much more strict mission in terms of prosecuting local crimes as well. Those are two levers at his disposal when it comes to that issue in particular.
The president also nominates judges for the District of Columbia.
That's a great point. Yeah. And, the other part is just he can lean on conservatives in Congress to make laws more, tough on crime or get rid of some of the progressive reforms that D.C. has enacted as well.
So there has been, over the 50 years of home rule under Democrats and Republicans, a basic, there's been kind of messing around with D.C. around the edges, but there hasn't been a whole lot of explicit legislating for D.C. There is home rule, and everyone has, I think often for selfish reasons, they don't want to be the person you call for a pothole. They've been content to have the kind of edifice of self-rule in place. When he talks about total takeovers of the city, that suggests a really different approach towards home rule than Democratic or Republican predecessors.
Yeah, and you wonder, like, how much of it is that just bluster? Obviously, we're talking about Trump here. And who wants to take over a $20 billion responsibility? That's what DC's budget is now. So, like, realistically, I think what's going to happen, and what my sources tell me, is that Congress, the Republican-controlled House, if it's still Republican, of course, they're going to be the lead on intervening in D.C. So if they want to micromanage D.C. laws, you're going to look to the House GOP committee chaired by James Comer to be the lead on intervention, which is what he's done already. I mean, if you look at his track record intervening in D.C. crime laws, other Republicans want to ban D.C. from disallowing right turn on red. All types of small, sort of maybe trivial matters. Republicans are going to have a lot of time on their hands and power on their hands if they can control both chambers of Congress.
So they could say forbid even the sort of semi-legal cannabis we have now.
I think anything is open. And like what you just said is an example of how Congress, instead of taking full control over the city, they're going to pick and choose and sort of play this game of, well, we can go after pot, we can go after non-citizen voting, we can go after, I think the latest thing was shutting down the DC Statehood Commission. It's an easy punching bag, especially if they control both chambers.
Is the idea that it would be done via the budget process? You know, we're going to pass resolutions forbidding you from spending your own tax money on such and such thing we don't like. Or could they just pass a law saying from here on, cannabis in all of its forms is forbidden in the nation's capital?
I think the budget process is just easier, and you sort of avoid the whole headlines and things as much as passing a full bill. But like one example is a new proposal would prohibit DC from enacting ranked choice voting. And that would be from the budget process because it would target the funding of any kind of move toward ranked choice voting in elections.
And just to be clear, these are all things that have been, particularly when the Republicans hold the Congress or any chamber, these are things that have been put forward, but have not made it into the rules because there's a Democratic president or a Democratic Senate. Is that right?
Right. Yes. So if they control both chambers, you can expect a hell of a lot more intervening in DC, prohibiting, environmental rules, getting rid of traffic speed cameras. I mean, some of these maybe listeners don't mind, but it's going to be very random what House Republicans will go after, and it will absolutely cause a nightmare for the city leadership because they don't know how to legislate if you're going to get knocked down from Congress in just a few months.
I think the biggest, highest profile issue is abortion. The Republican platform now says they believe it's up to states, but this is, as we know, not a state. So with an act of legislation, they could forbid abortion in the nation's capital, or they could, have a U.S. attorney who's going to enforce Comstock rules against abortion in D.C. Is that something they have talked about at all?
I haven't heard abortion specifically, but there's a history of that, right? Preventing D.C. from spending money on helping low-income women, get access to abortion. That's been a thing Republicans have pushed in the past. And, to add to that, Republicans say in their platform adopted this week that they want to reassert greater federal control over D.C. So on one level, they're handing things back to the states. But when it comes to D.C., they want to have more control over the federal capital city. So I think all of that is an open question. If Republicans in Congress want to go that direction and look at abortion, I'm sure that's going to be on the agenda as well.
Let's be real, lawsuits are not fun. But with Paulson Nance, at least they're a little easier. Paulson Nance is a DC law firm in every sense of the word. It was founded here in 1979. Partner Chris Nance is a local who cares deeply about the DC community, even serving on the board of the local branch of the Living Classrooms Foundation in his free time. Nance and his associates Samantha Peters and Maya Perry handle medical malpractice, wrongful death, and other complex injury cases. And they don't just settle every case. They'll go to court. They'll fight for you. Paulson Nance has even been recognized as one of U.S. News' best law firms. So if you have been hurt or lost a loved one because of someone else's mistake or negligence, call Paulson Nance for a no-obligation consultation. Visit www.paulsonandnace.com. That's PAULSONANDNACE.com. Or call 202-463-1999. So in sort of a more wonky area, the federal government, the executive branch, controls appointments to a bunch of these sort of weird boards and commissions that the people who cover the city run into every now and then that actually have like a pretty big impact on the city, like the Commission on Fine Arts in particular. Right there in the Republican platform this year, there is a call for D.C. to be made beautiful, to not allow modernist or unconventional architecture, to focus on what they call classic architecture, sort of Roman, Greek, Thomas Jefferson kind of stuff.
Yeah, they call it, in fact, they want to make it the most beautiful capital city. That's their slogan. And Trump has this preference for classical architecture. That's what he wanted the default for federal buildings to be. So, presumably a new FBI building would look less like a brutalist structure and more like something he would imagine out of ancient Rome. I don't know what he's really thinking when it comes to something like that, but there will be more micromanaging of decisions of that sort. Just the FBI building in specific, like he wants to keep it downtown. It's not something presidents usually personally get involved in. And the cityscape of downtown, again, will be impacted by the people he appoints, the planning decisions they make, the National Mall, the Freedom Plaza, all these kinds of iconic areas. He could definitely assert some touches and control over it.
So the conventional wisdom when he was president last time was that he wanted the FBI building to stay on Pennsylvania Avenue because he was concerned that if it went away, a hotel would replace it, and that hotel would compete with his hotel. Well, his hotel is not his hotel anymore. But you're saying that keeping the FBI in town is still a priority?
He still wants it. In last December, he posted in all caps, "Don't move the FBI," after Biden announced it was going to, after the Biden administration announced it would relocate to the Maryland suburbs. So he's very particular about the FBI building. It's not really clear to me why. Locals would, I think, prefer it to be demolished and redeveloped into mixed real estate, which I feel like someone like Trump might understand, given his background. But FBI building, he wants it in downtown. I don't really know why.
So as you mentioned, there's this other thing, which is that in addition to being sort of mostly empowered to enact laws that control the lives of people who happen to live in Washington, the president is also the chief of the biggest employer in Washington. And they have these radical plans in Project 2025, which he claims is not his, but it's written by a bunch of his allies. And there is a lot of talk of things like changing civil service protections in order to fire lots of people who in Washington had assumed that their jobs were kind of permanent.
Right. This Project 2025 that was developed by the Heritage Foundation, sure, he distanced himself from it. But again, people close to him came up with it. And Trump himself has said he wants to get rid of some of these civil servants. He said he wants to attack what he sees as this deep state, these people who get in his way. His dream regime is sort of a federal government that's not hostile to him, empowered by a conservative Congress and Supreme Court to back him up. And for locals living here, it's existential. The Heritage Foundation themselves have said the left is right to fear our plan to, quote, gut the federal bureaucracy. So they're very clear about what they want to do. And putting 54,000 loyalists, getting rid of the Department of Education, which is now part of the Republican plan, that's all going to affect what D.C. civil servants for years have lived in D.C.
If tens of thousands of federal workers are put out of jobs, and most of them resident in the district or the Maryland or Virginia suburbs, what does that do to the local economy? Is there any sort of conventional wisdom about that?
I don't know if there's been an analysis on that specifically, but I think there are around 300,000 federal workers who somewhat are based in D.C. They telework now. But, it's a big replacement of a lot of federal workers who probably live here already and then might get replaced with more conservative or ideologically aligned people. I mean, you got to figure that a lot of these might be outside of D.C. as well. I think most federal workers are based outside of the D.C. area. I mean, I've also considered, like, would he bring back federal workers into the office? Which, frankly, the D.C. mayor would appreciate that move, but not so much if he's gutting the federal government and taking jobs outside of her city.
Right. And, and the other thing is, beyond the specifics, the kind of deal in Washington, going back, to the beginning of the growth of the government, has been there are these jobs here. They require quite a bit of education or expertise. You are not ever going to make like law partner money. On the other hand, you're not nearly so exposed to risk of the boom bust of the economy. But all of a sudden, whether he's able to accomplish this all on day one or not, because a lot of people think it's illegal to just reclassify and fire people, it is introducing risk into a culture that didn't used to have as much of it. And I have to imagine that changes the city somehow.
I think you're seeing already a lot of apprehension in D.C. right now leading up to the election, right? I mean, I think you can sort of feel that in the air. A lot of people's jobs and lives depend on it. And a lot of people are wondering, are they going to stick around 4 more years or leave or what's going to happen? And if you talk about a wholesale change of the culture of the federal government from something where you're a career civil servant and the idea is that your job is insured no matter who's in office, that really does change the planning and the economic livelihood of generations of people in D.C. for sure, and the broader region as well. I mean, we're still a region focused on the federal government for its economy, even if there's been some diversification that's been on the edges, really.
D.C. local officials are looking at the same polls you and me are. Have they done any kind of advanced planning to try to improve their relationships on the Hill, on either side of the aisle, either to strengthen the spines of Democrats who they're going to need to filibuster stuff, or talk Republicans into not doing some of the stuff they want to do?
I've reported before that Mayor Bowser has not done such a stellar job at cultivating ties on Capitol Hill. Now, maybe that may have changed in the past few months, but I would assume that generally they have somewhat of a relationship with Comer's office directly. I know one of her senior advisors speaks to Comer's office on RFK and the future of that land. But when it comes to these items like intervening in D.C. laws and election and rules, D.C. does not have a great strategy to go to battle against that kind of an assault. They'll send letters to the Hill. They'll do all that kind of stuff. Eleanor Holmes Norton will try and lobby behind the scenes, but it's not a effective strategy to preventing Republicans from intervening in D.C. The best they can do is hope for some kind of collaboration on something like RFK or something like bringing federal workers back to the office. But D.C. does not have a plan to fight back against the new assault. They haven't, even in the past 2 years, had a cohesive plan to fight back against the interventions from Congress.
Hey, Cuneyt, thank you so much for being here.
Always a pleasure, Michael.
And that's all for today here on CityCast DC. If you enjoyed the show, why not tell a friend, rate the show, leave us a review, and subscribe to our morning newsletter. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Bye.